Hello and welcome to the Gilstrat channel. I'm JB, and today I'm going to talk about how I took all these wires out from under my layout and replaced them with this 16 gauge power bus wire. So stay tuned. Okay, so before I get into showing you how I rewired my layout, I want to explain to you what a power bus is. So let's take this standard track on a regular layout. And here's our DCC system. So the easiest thing you can do is just run some wires from your DCC system into your track. So we call that a power feed. And let's say you use a standard 24 gauge wire. Okay, this will work, but you'll get something called power drop, where the signal will get weaker and weaker the further it gets from the source. And this can cause your trains to operate erratically or completely stall and have other problems. So you want to try to reduce power drop as much as you can. So this is what a power bus does. So here we have our DCC system, and now we have a power bus. So this is a wire that usually runs underneath your layout parallel to the track. This is a heavier duty wire, let's say 16 gauge for N scale and HO scale. And this wire is connected directly into your DCC system. Then what you do is you run these thinner feeder wires, let's say 24 gauge, about every meter or 3 feet. When you do this, you greatly reduce the power drop. There's still going to be a little bit of power drop. It's inevitable, because there's resistance in all the wires and track, but this helps a lot, and you're going to have much smoother operation with your trains. When I originally wired my layout, I just used these splitter junction wired boxes that Kato makes. It was easy, I didn't have to do any soldering, and I figured, it's easy, just connect them together, and no problem. So this is what the wiring in my layout kind of looked like. This is simplified, but it gets the point across. So I ran one of these feeder wire junction boxes as a power feed from the DCC system, and then I connected a bunch of other ones into it. And then I ran feeder wires into the track. Now this has a couple problems. Okay, first of all, I'm using 24 gauge wire, which I should be using a more heavy duty wire to maintain strong signal strength. The next problem is with all these wires splitting, there's all these extra wires, and so the length of the wires is actually longer than the track. So the signal, if it's going through all these feeder wires, is traveling a further distance than it would if it was just going directly to the track. So this kind of defeats the point of having all these extra feeders. And I was having a lot of problems with signal loss, trains getting stuck. They were stopping right at feeder wires, and this was after I cleaned the track multiple times. So I figured it was time to fix this and rewire it. So I went and bought this about 16 gauge wire. I believe it's 1.25 millimeters squared. So it's a little bit smaller than 16 gauge, but it was the closest thing I could find at my local hardware store. So now this is what the wiring will look like. So first I will run a power bus with this 16 gauge wire. So this will go from the DCC system, and then it'll run in kind of like a diamond shape in a circuit underneath the layout. And then I will connect feeder wires from this power bus directly into my track. And I'll use the standard connectors that come from the Kato company. And that's about 24 gauge, I believe. You can see there's just a huge jumble of wires here. I tried keeping it organized using zip ties, but it didn't quite work. Also, you can see that there's a lot of extra wire coming out of these junction boxes that just isn't needed. Taking the old wires out took a little bit of time because I had to cut all the zip ties to remove everything. Finally, after removing everything, this was the mess of wires I was able to pull out from underneath my layout. After pulling out all the old wires, the next problem was figuring out how to attach the new Power Bus wires into the DCC system. Unlike the American version of the Digitrax Zephyr that has this special plug on the back where you can just feed bare wires and then screw them into place, the Japanese version of the system uses the Kato proprietary plugs, so I was going to have to find a way to make an adapter. So looking at this wiring diagram, you'll see that I have a power feed junction box splitter from Kato that is connected to the DCC system. I'm going to need to keep this first one, and I'll explain why. First, I have my program test track that is connected to my DCC system using the Kato extension wires that have the plugs. So I need to keep it for connecting this to my DCC system. The next thing is I also have some station and locomotive storage tracks that are connected to these on and off toggle switches, which also require the Kato connector plugs. So I want to leave these connected as well. So I'm going to move the mainline tracks. I'm going to remove those. And then I'm going to add the power bus. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to solder in the 16 gauge wire into one of the already existing plugs on a power feed junction box splitter wire and then connect that to the DCC system. First, I had to push out the old metal pins from the plastic plug. I used a screwdriver and pushed down on it to try to push the pins out. It took a little bit of working, but I was able to loosen up the pins eventually. And with a little bit more work, I was able to get them to come out. Next, I took the new power bus wires, stripped the very end, and then attached them to the pins and soldered them together. Once the soldering was completed, I pushed the pins back into the plastic plug. So here you go, here's the final product. I've got the power bus wires coming out of the plug, as well as the wires going to the junction box. Now let me discuss how I will actually attach the wires of the power bus underneath the layout. So as I've mentioned before, I am using a camping table, a foldable camping table, as the benchwork for my train layout. As such, the tabletop is actually very thin. It's too thin for me to screw things into or to even use a staple gun and staple the wires to the underside of the layout. So what I'm going to have to do is be a little creative and use some of the support structures for the table to hold the wires in place. First, I can use the cross table support beam. So this is a support beam that runs through the middle of the table, and it's where the two halves of the folding table come together. There's technically two support beams here, but they're right next to each other and they act like just one beam. So I can use this as a way to hold the wires up. The next thing I can use are these cross braces that run the long lines of the table. They're very thin, but I'll be able to attach the wires to this. So I have these supports. Then I have to be able to use the power and control rack and connect wires from this. So this is the power control rack. This is where the DCC system is and all the other controllers. So I'll need to run a wire from here up to the underside of the table. So first what I'll do is I will attach these wire hook brackets to the cross braces. They look like this. They basically just stick onto the cross brace, and then I use some zip ties to make sure they won't fall off if the sticky gets weak over time. Next, what I'll do is, because the cross beams are wide enough, I'm just going to drill some holes into them, like this. And then I can just run the wires through these holes, and this will hold the wires up. So what I will essentially do is I will feed the wires the black and red wire, which will be connected together. I'll plug them into the DCC system using the plug that I made earlier. Then I'll feed the wires through, and then I will split the black and the red wire and run them separately. This will make it much easier for me to attach the feeder wires. Then I'll just run these separate wires through the hooks and the wire holes, and it'll get this diamond shaped look. So it'll look kind of like this, where I have the wires going through the hooks and through the holes in the crossbeam. Then lastly, I will attach the feeder wires. So let's say here's our track, and then I will attach the feeder wires, soldering them directly to the power bus wires. I know a lot of people like to use the terminal blocks, but in this case, just to save some money and time, I'm just going to use some wire strippers, strip the power bus wires, and then solder the feeder wires directly to them. I'm going to use the Kato wire feeders that plug directly into the Kato track. What I will simply do is the end that's designed to plug into the DCC system, I'll cut off that plug, strip the wire, and then solder it directly to the power bus. First, I connect in the wires to the DCC system using the new plug I just made, and then I begin the long, laborious process of feeding the wires and straightening everything out in the power and control rack. Once I finished running the wires to the control rack, I split them and then ran them through the wire hooks and the holes as explained previously. Once I finished running the power bus wires through the layout, it was time to connect the feeder wires. As you can see, I took the standard Kato wires that connect into the track and I cut off the plug at the end. Then I stripped the ends and twisted the light colors together, so the white wires together and the blue wires together. Then I took my wire strippers and I stripped a gap onto both the black and red power bus wire. Then I attached the feeder wires and soldered everything together. I repeated this process 3 more times for the other feeder wires. Lastly, I ran the power bus wires back into themselves. I stripped a gap on the wires and attached them together and soldered it. This way, the power bus wires made a complete loop or circuit. Then I covered up all of my solder joints with some color matching electric tape. As you can now see, the layout wiring is now much more organized and straightened up. But most importantly, as you can see here, my trains are running nice and smooth. I now have a good strong DCC signal throughout the entire layout, and my trains don't act erratically or have problems getting stuck or stopping. So, all in all, I would say this was a successful rewiring of my layout. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you like this video or are interested in Japanese trains or trains in general, I invite you to please subscribe to this channel. You can also check out my website at gilshrat.info. Additionally, I'm on Facebook at facebook.com/Gilshrat and Twitter at twitter.com/Gilshrat channel. And once again, thanks for watching.